Okay, good afternoon, dear participants of the conference. I am very happy to see all of you here, to see those people who are in the audience and who watch us online. I'm Danila Evstifeev. I'm a freelance translator. I work with Levsha Studio. Before I took part in translating several indie projects, and today I would like to tell you about translation of board games. Alexander just told you about translation of computer games, video games, officially and unofficially. As for the board games translation, Danila, I'm sorry. Couldn't you please share your presentation? Okay, I was one of those fan translators who started from fan translations, actually, and later I started translating officially. I can tell you about the life and suffering of Sir Brunt, the translation made by Levsha Studio that I took part in. In addition, I also translated several board games for Giga games, such as Watergate board game about the Watergate scandal, and the Road of Adventures, which is very important one. For some years, I've been translating into English comics for the Bubble Publishing House, and moreover, I was one of those fans who edited and proofread such games as Hollow Knight and Loop Hero, which has recently been released, and Forgotten Anne. So I used as a translator and editor. I must say that these board games have a lot in common. Board games, computer games, they are actually quite similar. Video games and board games have their own rules, they have their own goals, the players have to reach their goals using manipulations. In video games, there are components, there are some components, of course, but board games have such components as cards, chips, fields, or words. They have defined resources and so on and so forth. Sometimes words can also be components of the game. For example, there is such an excellent game which is called Mice Guard. If you play it with your friends, you need to play with games, you need to play against the mice, and you need to protect the kingdom. In addition, there is Mafia, which is a well-known board game, and this game which I've shown to you, such as Resistance. And there is a very important game which is called The Hat, where words or pieces of paper are important components. And of course, all board games must have players. Of course, there are sole games, but there shall be at least one player. Board games, in contrast to video games, they have some kind of physical stuff. There are some intangible, non-material games, such as The Hat, but there are board games where there are no rules, such as Fort. And there are no rules in the games. There is only a deck of cards, which actually describe the rules. There are different sizes of board games, from pocket games to big games. For example, such games as billiards, it can also be considered a board game. And rules, it is also an important component. These components can be of different qualities. Some of them can be irreplaceable, others can be easily replaced. For example, as for the Watergate game, there is a deck of cards, two deck of cards, and they cannot be replaced by another deck. Or there might be chips which can be replaced by coins, for example. There are different editions of games, such as gift editions. For example, The Hat can be bought in such an excellent gift box. As for the genres of board games, there are a lot of them, of course. Video games are also quite varied, but as for the board games, they are actually much more old. They are much older. There are family games, there are children games, strategic games, adventure games, educational games, cooperative games, and competition games. There are games in where you compete against each other, such as Mafia, or other games where you compete as a team against a virus, for example. For example, the pandemic, which we all have right now. There are card games, or dice games, or games with other components. There are adventure games, or games where you have to draw something, where you need to create something new to make a picture. There are word games, language games. For example, Mafia is a language game. Alias, which is very popular today, this is a language game. There are detectives. There are abstract games and thematic games. The latter, this is an example is a resistance game, or for example there are chess, and every chess part is very important. There are many other games. Among, for example, video games, there are a lot of new games, but the same process happens in the board games. For many years, the board games has been quite popular, and we need to translate all of that. Translation is but a part of localization process of a board game, because board games almost always they do have something physical. Something material. That is why localization is very important. So the first stage is translation itself, then editing and proofreading, which are usually done by editors, freelancers, or those who work at an agency. There are some things which are not closely related to the translator, such as design, layout, and pre-press. The result of this localization is usually a material, tangible product. Of course, you can try to recreate a game using different components, but usually there is a defined list of components. Board games and video games are for entertainment. So this is an entertaining product. And second, they need to be educational. They also need to be useful, because if a game is not useful, why shall I play it? Board games have one very important disadvantage from the point of view of translation. Because it is a tangible project, you cannot translate it once again if it has already been printed. If, for example, it turns out that there is an error, that there is one more chess piece in a set of chess, well, it would be quite confusing. Depending on the fact how material are disadvantages of a particular game, it might be minor or critical. It might be a huge disappointment, and it might lead to a lot of financial losses. What is also very important is that video games, or the algorithm, happens without you. If something was improperly translated using some manipulations, no matter how they are called, no matter how they are done, if you do it the right way, you will be able to play the game. You can just click a button, do something, and I hope all of you did this.
Remember when you played some old games and you managed just to win them when you were just playing by chance, and it worked. But it can never work with board games, because all players are responsible for all moves during their game process. If there is a typo in the rules, it can destroy the whole game process. And so there is much high quality demand, and it can be interactive only if people understand fully how to do it. If you give some unclear instructions, and for example, I remember a situation with experiment in some Chinese rooms. So Does it sound like we are translating some technical manual? In some way, because games can be different, because the game can be like this hat, some can be entertaining, or some are really simple games, for example, story cubes. We have many analogous games, and so we have 10 dice, and you can do whatever you want with them. So that's not just, we don't need complicated technical instruction how to play it, just simple rules, so simple explanation. So what is also interesting that usually you have all the materials from the very beginning in comparison to video games. Because if translator of the board game, when they get the rules and everything, so usually they can check how all these components look like. Maybe you even can try to print out this game in some crude version and try to play it. And that's a huge advantage because, of course, you have higher demands about quality, but you can understand the game better from the outset. Also, usually we get some additional devices. Timers, a phone, for example, can be used, or maybe some hints, some explanations for players. And I think for the past 6 or 7 years, where we started to get some special apps to play some board games. Some games don't even play if you don't use special website or special app, and I think that's like advantage and disadvantage. But even if we use app, we still have some tangible material component. And I think that the rules for the games, they sound like some technical text, because that's the reason why I use algorithm in the name of my presentation. For example, let's look at this game Watergate. Big part of this book, that's actually the explanation how you should play it. You have a clear explanation of every phase with pretty technical language, what you need to do step by step, and the language that you need to use when you translate, it has to be not like it has to be interpreted only in one way. No misunderstanding, no multiple interpretation, because the players, they have to understand what they need to do. Because it can lead to conflicts, to destroying the whole process. For example, the easiest example, did you know that when you play Monopoly, if nobody wants to... No, actually, if somebody gets to the place which hadn't been sold yet, then there should be an auction and somebody has to pay it, to buy it. And so, which means that it's very important to explain rules, because some games can get 1 hour, 3 hours longer if we don't explain some little aspect which can lead the flow of the game. And of course, it can ruin the reputation of the game itself. On the other hand, all the conflicts around Monopoly improved the game overall. Again, terminology. So that's actually based on what I have said. For example, what I often need to think over, do you need to turn or turn around the card? Are we talking about card? For example, like, and we put it next to, by, or around. Do you think that that matters? Or do you feel that these are synonyms? Yeah, but we are talking about vertical and horizontal direction. And around, it means that we can move, for example, to 8 different playing fields. So we need to be extremely precise. For example, the word hero, so which I needed to add it. That's where I needed to check all this terminology. Or, for example, the Road of Adventure, which I also mentioned, that's where I needed to think about every word in terminology. Are we talking about chip, token, So usually, if we talk about token, that's something flat, or if we're talking about marker, it's something more vertical. These are just usually some. This something that if you sneeze, it doesn't fly off the table. So that's how you define which word to choose. Let's look at the classical example. These are two cards. That's where the heroes, so the characters, they are fighting together against their common opponent, and we see a card of a character. And then we have this very technical component explaining how this card works. And on every component and on every rule, on every page of the rule, what is very important with board games? Because we have some part of beautiful text and then technical text. And usually we need to be extremely precise with the technical part. So how do we know which part we consider to be technical? On this card, for example, in the middle, we can see types of cards. We have, on this left card, we have equipment and limited. And the card on the right is ongoing. These types of cards, or types of components, if they're separated, that means a lot. Usually other cards or special rules, they refer to these cards. For example, we can see a Quant game. They have some issues with beautiful collection edition. So they had different types of cards with spells, and so they had a separate types of cards with cards of spells and cards of some charms. But then there is in this special confusion in this collection game, there was a confusion about spells and charms. But it was only in video game, and they, of course, they didn't do it in the board game because it could have led to some really big issues. So actually republishing the game. So also the name of the card is also important, and you need to be very consistent what you use. And then, of course, we have description. If the game is interconnected, if all components are interconnected for every card, so then we need to, like, the more precise we need to have. So you see the size of the text block. So very often developers of board games, they usually leave some extra space because, as you know, that Russian or other Slavic languages, they are longer, and so they leave extra space to put all the text together. Then even illustrations can mean something important. For example, if sometimes they can picture something that is not allowed to do, and usually there is a reference about this, and we also sometimes can see some words in the picture, and we also need to translate them. So basically that's the way how we translate it, all the senses and all the technical details of this part. That was a very quick translation. I worked here as a translator, and I decided to, as an example on the left card, I decided to show if we don't take into account the length of certain section. So that's not like the task of a translator, but sometimes it's important to think about these aspects. But some aspects still are important even in the work of translator. For example, if you talk about equipment and limited, both words are pretty long in Russian, so maybe the translator should have used a different synonym. And when we translate everything precisely and clearly, then we can add some quotes or some text. So the text of the game is quite specific for every game, and if the theme is stronger, then of course we have more text. If we look at Watergate, we have 24 pages of rules, and 14 out of them, that's basically some journalist investigation about Watergate scandal, which was a big part of translation. Or, for example, on every card of Watergate, we have a text that's about 1/4 of the whole card. If we talk about more abstract games, usually they don't give any text explanations. So, have you ever read any stories when you read rules how to play chess? But some games, they are completely based on that. So usually that's when we are talking about role games, role board games. So here, basically, this story, it gives you some sense. Board games, in comparison to different technical devices or products, that's something for general public. And so your translation has to be simple, understandable. You don't need to go through additional course to translate Monopoly, but you can just study the rules, maybe look at the box and try to understand the game. But of course, there are some exceptions with 40,000 pages of Warhammer. But for example, if you buy a basic board game for your child, you don't want to read 40,000 pages how to play this game. And of course, the games, they give a good mood, some skills. For example, you develop your language or counting skills, or some knowledge, communication. When you are communicating, that like, oh my God, what happened here? So that's really good for friends. Also, these games, they are good for friendship and understanding, and especially friendship is important when we play Mafia, for example, and we should forget what had just happened when we played there. Also, games can help people overcome some conflict situations, and games should give you a chance to develop your tactics and strategy, which means that when you get a board game, so definitely during localization, translation, you will be able to look at the copy of the game or the files with all components and rules. You need to be able to imagine this game for yourself. You need to understand the basic mechanics of games. Of course, you need to know their source language and the language that you translate it into. I think that's basically enough for translating some video games. But the translator of board games, it's important to understand the context, to be consistent with context. So what I mentioned about spells and charms.
It is very important to understand the cards because all the algorithm is also very important. For translator, it is also important to adhere to the same terminology because you cannot call a shaman a sorcerer in different parts of the game, especially, for example, if shaman and sorcerer are two different chips. It is important to ensure understanding. It is very important to understand what is happening in the game. If there is the opportunity, you can contact the developers of the game. Developers of board games usually respond, usually answer the questions, and they are eager to do that. Much more eager than developers of video games. They usually work closely with publishing houses, and your editor will be the intermediary between you and the publishing house. If you see something wrong in the rules of the game, don't leave it there. And if you don't understand something, most probably it will impact the translation, and nobody will correct that if you do not do that. Your task is to provide ease of understanding and to find the best translation of the original text. You shall leave the literal and technical. The more literal, the more artistic the original text is, the better you need to translate. And any algorithm may go wrong. Did you ever had cases when you had to trick to win in a game? Probably you have relatives that you never play because they trick or twist some rules of the game. For editor and translator board games, this is very important, and this is actually a very important skill because they may understand where this algorithm may go wrong. Your task is to know where the word card instead of word any card or this card can completely distort the game. You need to understand that and to translate it properly. And I ask you, please do understand and appreciate the work of the editor. Editors are just people just like you. Most often they are translators in the past, and they will check everything that you do. If you make a mistake, they will need to correct that. As a translator and editor of board games and video games, let me ask you the following. Of course, translator needs to know the source language and the target language, but you also need to understand this sphere, the area you're working in, or at least you have to respect it. If you don't understand something, please communicate with the developers. As my colleague has said in his presentation several before, it is necessary to understand. Communication is key. Googling won't help if the right question wasn't asked in the right time. And let me reiterate, if you really like board games, if you really like playing board games, you need to get acquainted with different genres, to write to publishing houses and see whether you have the opportunity to become a translator of board games. At least I think I will end my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Danila, thank you so much. So let's give a round of applause to Danila. Well, I really love board games, so everything that Danila has told you about it is very important, because even in video games we also face similar challenges. So thank you so much. Are there any questions from the audience? Any questions to Danila about localization of board games? Well, it's not. Well, it's not even a question, it's rather something that I think about, that in my experience, I know that we even almost fought with my friends or relatives when there were differences in the rules of the game. So sometimes you can even lose a friend because something was improperly translated. Well, yeah, I know that I can relate. That is why all of the rules are equipped with illustrations. so players understand them easily. I think this is what has happened within the past 10 years. Now it is much easier, but when translating, you need to pay attention to this. Well, I lost more than one friend because of that, because of the wrong rules of board games. As for the mouse guard game, well, not really in this game, but in a similar board game, a term was translated in a wrong way, and one of the characters became too strong. That is why it was impossible to play it. But the Mouse Guards board game is translated very well. So, what is the publishing houses that are into contact? Because probably I will change my specialization. Well, there are different publishing houses. For example, in Russia, I can think of Gaga Games, of course. I've been working with them. Crowd Games, they specialize in games where rules are very important. For example, Galaxy, I really value this game because it is well prepared. There are hobby games who released very famous spy ball game, and there are other less famous, less popular publishing houses who are looking forward to meet their future translators. Thank you. Any questions? Okay, so we have no more questions from the audience, though I do have one. Are there any disclaimers about something like if you do not agree on the rules beforehand, you risk losing your friends after playing this game? Well, usually it depends on the publishing house. This is one of those minor things, one of those details that you cannot think of if you don't encounter it in real life. Usually we have to take into account such things ourselves, and very often when translating a board game into Russian, the volume of the text increases, not because that Slavic languages are longer, but because there are some additional moments that we add ourselves to the games, because when we tested this game, the translator or the editor encountered some things which were not really correct. The developer of this game said that really there is this problem. That is why we decided to add an explanation so players do not face this challenge. So, shortly speaking, we do not add disclaimers like this, but usually we sometimes add something like that so it doesn't happen. So we don't lose any friends when playing board games. Okay, so let's sum up our discussion. It's high time to do that. Danila, thank you so much for your presentation.